Welcome to the Hospitality Maverick podcast with me, Michael Tingser. We at Hospitality Mavericks are here to inspire leaders to create heart-centered and profitable businesses from the inside out, the kind both employees and customers love and support. In this episode, I have a great guest, Victoria Williams, which is the founder of terptree, a multi-award-winning business with a mission to change the world for deaf people by revamping the everyday customer experience. As you will hear, Victoria lives and breathes this organization. She's a powerhouse of passion and inspiration. This episode is very relevant as we go into times where developing new revenue streams and making your business more inclusive becomes a must. Victoria tells about that alone in the UK there is more than 11 million people living with a hearing disability, and many of them often struggles when they go shopping or dining. That's a huge potential market to serve. Victoria gives some great advice on how to tap into this market by just changing small things in your customer journey. This episode was an eye-opener for myself, and I'm sure you will take something from it as well. So grab headphones, pen and notebook and enjoy. We are in the last week of September 2020, and the pandemic is still roaring out there, as we talked about on many of the episodes since March. Today, we're not going to talk about maybe a directly linked issue in operation or leadership as many of the other podcasts. This is a bit of different focus, but all to the good, because there's a massive opportunity commercially out there. There is a 12 million people that is not properly served in the UK. And therefore, we today have invited Victoria Williams from terptree to talk about world-class deaf customer experience. And I can tell you there's some eye-openers in here in the conversation I had with Victoria. And I think this becomes even more relevant as we have seen the rules around face mask in retail, restaurants has gone up, and the challenge is being a deaf person in that environment. But enough of me talking about it. Let's hand over to the real expert. So welcome to the podcast, Victoria.
Thanks for having me. Very exciting opportunity, and really looking forward to being able to share with your listeners some real things that they can do to make their experiences much more accessible for deaf customers, but also deaf employees right now in the middle of a pandemic where face mask wearing is now mandatory, as you said, in both retail and hospitality arenas. So this should be very helpful for people, hopefully.
I was introduced to you to my network and said, you need to have a chat with Victoria. She's on a brilliant journey, it's been a life mission. Can you just give people out there a bit about the story about who is Victoria and what kind of organization is that you have spent, I don't say it's wrong, a bit more than a decade building?
Scary to think of it like that, isn't it? But yes, absolutely, you're right. It is a bit of a life mission and vision for me. As a business, we've been established for 14 years now. So we were 14 years old last Sunday. So we did have a little birthday party, socially distanced, obviously, and with a minimum of 6 people, just to put that out there. And we have a vision as a business to change the world for deaf people. So we have a mission that by 2025, we would have positively impacted 1 million deaf people's lives. So for us as a business, we do this by revamping the everyday employee and customer experience provided by the UK's biggest brands. So it started really for me when my cousin Max was born. He's now 27 years old. So he was born deaf into a hearing family. So we were a family who'd never met a deaf person before, had no experience of deafness, didn't know how to communicate with a deaf person. And I was 13 when Max was born and when he was diagnosed as profoundly deaf. So as a family, we all started learning British Sign Language pretty much immediately. So for me, this has been part of my life for a very, very long time, since the age of 13. I'm 40 now, I'm not embarrassed to say. And so it's been, this is what I've done with my life. When I left school, from the age of 19, started working for a number of charities. I worked for the British Deaf Association, one of the largest deaf charities in the UK. I went on to establish a support service for deaf people in London, worked in mental health as well, and then trained to become a sign language interpreter. So I'd done all of that before the 14 years of establishing terptree. So it's been really beneficial for me because I come at this with a wealth of experience that I've gained during my time in working, on the ground with deaf people, and it's given me a real insight into the barriers and challenges that deaf people face on a day-to-day basis. So that's a little bit about me.
So, terptree, can you tell a bit more about what you set out in the world to do and what you have achieved in your 14 years? Because that's quite a track record for any organization to stay relevant.
Thank you. We started a business as an interpreting agency because, coming from my interpreting background, we sort of wanted to, I guess, improve how interpreting services were delivered, because what I recognised at the time is that people were sending unqualified interpreters. So you'd have a deaf person, for example, in a job interview, they'd be sent with an interpreter who's not qualified, probably not get the job because actually they're not being represented fully by a qualified interpreter. And I couldn't stand the idea of that, really. Reflecting on my experience of having a deaf cousin, I hated the idea of him being put in that like-minded position. So that's what we sort of started at. But then I guess over time became really frustrated about the fact that interpreters can solve the problem that's happening right there and then. So, impact that communication barrier that's happening at that time. But that's a very short-term win. It's not a long-term gain. So I was very conscious that I wanted to do something that had real social impact, and that it not just impacted that one deaf person in that one interaction, but impacted way more deaf people. So we got to the position where we are now, having worked with people like the Houses of Parliament on how deaf people access Parliament and how they understand about the parliamentary systems, having worked with people like the Royal Albert Hall, more recently working with British Airways to help them improve their deaf customer journey, Legal & General looking at their whole customer journey, and lots of other organisations in lots of different sectors. We work across sector. So it's really sort of culminated for us in being able to share our expertise over the years that we've gained, our expertise and experience with these large brands. And as I said earlier, looking both at the deaf employee experience and the deaf customer experience, because if you support your deaf employees, they're advocates of your brand to your deaf customers. If you support their deaf employees, they can thrive in their roles, and you get higher levels of loyalty from deaf employees. And as I said earlier, with the stats of 12 million deaf people in the UK, that's 1 in 6 of the population. So that's an absolutely huge number. So if we think about it, if we're not serving our deaf customers well, we're automatically alienating 1 in 6 of our customers. And that number's only going to grow. So by 2035, it's predicted that number will increase to 15.6 million. So we're talking about a growing population of a large part of your consumer groups. And certainly the spending power of disabled people is currently estimated to be worth 249 billion in the UK alone. So we're talking about a huge opportunity that's sort of, not really recognised oftentimes, that's really worth sort of engaging with.
What are we talking about? Do you know the numbers on a global level? Because it's astronomically, if you're thinking about just on a UK level, as you said, a third, of the consumer base. What would you know? Do you know any global numbers to put that in perspective?
Yeah, so we're talking about 366 million deaf people across the world. So it's not a small number. And what we need to remember of that, because we're not talking about sign language users. I mean, that's obvious, because if not, we would see people using sign language every day, all day, as we went out and done what we've done in our daily life. What we're talking about is a third, really predominantly a third of the over 65s has a hearing loss. So we're talking about a large number of people that are in these sort of older age demographics that have hearing loss. But the good thing for us, because it's so important that deaf people who use sign language, who actually have a smaller group of people but have a larger need, are recognised in that larger group so that their needs are fully catered for as well. But we're talking about a large group of people. And it's ironic, really, because deaf customers are sort of treated as a minority, but if we look at the numbers, actually, the numbers speak for themselves in terms of the fact that they're underserved by most industries. But there's a massive, massive opportunity here to be had by businesses that really want to make that social impact and do something really great for the community as well.
Yeah, and I guess we have talked about it outside the podcast as well. I know you support the global goals from the UN, and it's something that stands me very close, because I think they give you a a good steering or an intent to actually be part of solving problems for people, communities, and the planet, which we all have to come together around. The pandemic is just another sign of that. We as a human race have just gone too far. We have played a bit too much with the planet, normal natural rules, and therefore it's kicking us a bit back. So again, what is it that you are supporting when you talk? There's 17 goals in the UN global goals. What goals are you striving to support in making the world a better place?
Yeah, so the two goals that we really strive to work on is goal number 4, which is quality education. So that's looking at eliminating all discrimination in education and improving universal literacy and numeracy. And then number 10, which is reduced inequalities. So that's ensuring equal opportunities and to end discrimination. So both of them, I mean, we know with the global goals, if they are backed up by government, businesses, society, and the general public, we, as you said, we can build that better future for everyone. So I think we as businesses, certainly as small businesses, do have that power to make significant change in the world, and that's why we're here. We want to make that huge change. So I think in terms of quality education, you would assume that we're talking about developing countries, but actually we're not. We're talking about the UK as well. There was an example the other day which is really interesting. A friend of mine works in a school, and she has a colleague that's just started working in the school. This is literally a situation that I've been made aware of in the last couple of weeks. So the colleague's been recruited to work as a TA, so a teaching assistant, and a teaching assistant across years. It's a secondary school. But what she's found herself in the position of is that she's been placed in a position where she is working alongside a deaf child who uses sign language. Now, this teaching assistant doesn't have any experience of sign language whatsoever, but they've tried to recruit locally and find someone who has experience of sign language. They haven't been able to find someone, so they're now in a position where there's a year 7 deaf student in a secondary school who has a teaching assistant with them who can't use sign language, who is there to provide, and I put in inverted commas, access to that child's education. Not great, right? And what's even more interesting is he is educationally, he's behind on where he needs to be because he didn't get that access in primary school, he didn't get that access in nursery. So a lot of the foundational learning that would have happened in those settings, had he have had an accessible setting, he wouldn't have had the same problems he's having now in secondary. And now that's being sort of even more compromised by the fact he doesn't have access now. So quality education is absolutely key. And it's funny because we think to ourselves, we're in 2020, children get educated to the level they should be in the UK, but we still find ourselves with deaf children right now. And this is, like I said, a real life example of what's happening in a school in the UK right now. And if you think about that being one example, that won't be the only one child who's having that experience. There'll be numbers of children having that same problem. So it's quite frankly not good enough. So I think all of us are responsible to understand where the challenges are and where the problems are in terms of where children are not receiving that quality education, and improving that literacy and numeracy. And then with reduced inequalities, I mean that's a given with what we're talking about really in terms of our mission. But really offering equal opportunities and ending discrimination. So for us, coming at it from the deaf employee and deaf customer standpoint, we're talking about it from both of those perspectives. Deaf employees being able to access their peer group, having access to promotional opportunities, really having full reign over any of the opportunities in front of them. And deaf customers being able to not be frowned at because they're not wearing a mask in the current climate, because they are exempt from wearing a mask, as an example of that, or being frowned at because the communication's not working. And those sort of tiny things that in terms of if we experience those things as humans, they really affect us internally. So those are two goals that are really crucial for us. And we, through the work that we do, we work with a partner organisation called Buy One, Give One, and we give back when we do client work. We give back to B1, G1 as a result of funding projects that they run, basically. So we look at supporting deaf children across the world with literacy and lots of other sort of overseas projects that they run as well. So so that's what we do in terms of the global goals.
That's amazing because it's as you said, it's all the small push on the flywheel we all can do on the different goals we put up for our businesses. And it's not about being perfect. It's about taking one step at a time. It's marginal gains, I normally say to people. You don't have to save the world, but you can do your little bit in your little area. that will then accumulate with all the other action in the right direction. And I guess that it's maybe a bit of putting the answer in your mouth in a way. But this is the time, isn't it? Isn't it this the time where
Yes,
business,
yes.
because business is changing, people are changing. This is the time we all think about how can we make better impact? How can we spend our consumer dollars better, and so on and so on.
And I would argue that before, I mean, if you look at stats or reports about what employees are looking for, or what applicants are looking for in positions in companies, they're looking to now, this sort of new generations are looking to work for companies that have a bigger mission than just making money. That's what they want to do. So they want to work for companies where they're fulfilling the role that they want to fulfill based on their professional experience, but they want to be able to give back in a bigger way. They don't just want to turn up for work and leave and go home. So we're talking about a generation of people who that's what they're looking for. They're not just looking for a role, they're looking for that way of giving back as well. And I think absolutely right now, where if you look at sort of the early times during the pandemic, certainly in lockdown, it was all about supporting and raising people up. You know, even going out every Thursday and clapping for our NHS workers and other key workers. That's a sign that we're supporting and we're getting behind those people. And even small tokens like that, it's just showing that we're thinking about other people and we're caring for them. So I think it was important before. I think it's always been there, and that's been a growing awareness of how people, you know, are looking for employment, but also how people are shopping. People are looking for ethical providers, sustainable source of providing food, beauty products. So I think we've already been on that, but I think the pandemic's really given us that extra push to go, do you know what? Who are these people that are living around us? We need to start thinking about other people around us. So I think the brands that can really understand and harness this right now are going to be in a really, really sensible position sort of moving forward.
Talking about the pandemic, if you take it from your organization and deaf people, how have this situation impacted you as an organization, and then your community as well?
Well, it's been so there's two sort of one major sort of theme, and it's sort of true for the general population anyway, is isolation, but then moving that on to exclusion. So isolation's been sort of something that's affected numbers of people across the world due to the pandemic. We can't sort of just suggest that that's affected deaf people alone or disabled people alone. You know, people who've been shielding, that have been having to stay at home due to health issues that ordinarily wouldn't have felt isolated. But in addition to that, for deaf people, it's been exclusion. And that's not, again, to suggest that any business or organisation has attempted to exclude deaf people. But in terms of the mandatory face coverings situation, obviously they became mandatory for customers on the 23rd of July. But then, as we saw, the bigger change that's happened yesterday was retailers and hospitality outlets having to ensure that their staff are wearing face coverings as well. So previous to that, from July up until now, it's been challenging for deaf people communicating as customers. But now we're looking at the span being even more complicated, because really, as a deaf customer, if the retail member of staff or the hospitality member of staff is not wearing a face covering, the deaf person, even if they have a face covering on, are able to lip read that person. Now that both parties are wearing face masks, the ability to lip read is now impossible because you can't see someone's lips. So it's that's a massive challenge, and it's not a challenge that's going to go away quickly, because we are still dead in the middle of a pandemic, and realistically we've got a long way to get out of this still. So it's what we talk about with organizations is really understanding their processes, so really getting to grips with how they greet customers, and making the most of those opportunities, but also understanding the other sort of tools and tech that they can use around that to make this frontline, certainly right now, this frontline experience much easier for deaf customers. And then you've got the deaf employee problem, whereby now, as I said, in retail outlets you've got, and hospitality, you have deaf employees that are having to wear a face mask and try and get understood and understand through face coverings. So it's a challenge on sort of both sides of the coin, and it's really interesting right now because there's lots of different Facebook groups for deaf people where they congregate and talk about experiences already, but a number of groups since the start of the pandemic have come up to just simply talk about the pandemic and the challenges. And some of the experiences since the ruling came in about the changes that happened yesterday, the 28th of September, about face coverings being mandatory in these settings, deaf people's responses as both customers and employees were worrying. We go back to that sort of isolation and exclusion piece. Um, for example, so an example of a comment, I'm really struggling at work at the moment. I work in retail in the food department. I've only been back for 4 days and already feel stressed and upset. And then other comments such as, ignorance is a big stumbling block for us deaf people now that masks are compulsory. I used to work in retail. It was hard enough without the added complication of face masks. So that's from an employee perspective. And then you've got deaf customers saying, I just hope that retail staff will recognise to pull their mask down. The mask wearing is making life so hard for deaf people. I've actually been in tears over it. And then lastly, it's a constant struggle. And with this COVID, it's a lot harder than ever, exhausting. So that just highlights that feeling of not just isolation, but exclusion and the effect that that's having on deaf people's mental health as well.
This is a complex challenge because this is mandatory by law now. So if you as a company doesn't follow these rules, there could be, financial consequences and damage on brand and so on. Is there anyone out there that you have seen has been very good? And maybe it's all going to change now with the new ruling. I know that. But is there anyone that has shown that, very good practice as a brand that they are, or an organization, they are trying to do their best, the best intent to make this the best possible experience on both sides of the experience, the employee and the customer experience?
Yeah, well, one early example, which was really great, was Waterstones, the book reseller. And they basically had at their till points signs saying, if you're deaf and need to lip read, let us know and we will communicate in a different way. So something really, really simple. I mean, we're talking about printing something on a sign and putting it at the front till area. So it's really funny because I think businesses get really caught up in going, wow, how do we do that? What tech do we put in place, or how do we resolve this problem? And it really is sort of simple things. It doesn't have to be complicated. So I think examples like that are great. And even putting signage at the beginning of an entrance of an area explaining that same thing, having staff members that are particularly there for deaf customers. There are lots of different ways that are sort of simple things to implement so they're manageable, because we know that right now, with the amount of changes that businesses are having to make, it's challenging. There's also such things as, even as a business, offering people the opportunity to wear a badge or wear a lanyard or something to identify they have a hidden disability, so that team members know that they have a hidden disability and therefore can support communication. So there's lots of different schemes in place. So the scheme I just said about in terms of the sunflower lanyards, they're basically green lanyards that have sunflower icons along the lanyard stream. And it's a lanyard that a customer would wear in order to identify themselves as having a hidden disability. So it's something that started in the aviation industry. They're discreet because it's just a lanyard, but it allows colleagues in stores to be alerted to the fact that that customer may need to communicate differently. So they're being used across airports and airlines, and not all airlines, but widely across that sector. But more recently, in some supermarkets, including Sainsbury's and Tesco's as well, and some others. So it's a scheme that's for customers with hidden disabilities. So we're talking about customers who have a hearing loss or are deaf, customers who are autistic, customers who may be experiencing dementia, customer groups that you wouldn't physically or visually see that they have a disability. So it's schemes like that are definitely have always been worth considering, but are definitely worth considering now, whereby that's a visual indicator for team members to know that communication is going to need to happen differently. So there's interesting ways to resolve these challenges. It doesn't have to be big, high tech, expensive solutions. When we talk about communication, it's all about that human interaction, isn't it? And about that connection. And that's what we're really looking to improve.
Yeah, and it's actually about meeting people where they are, and actually don't presume that you know where they are and what they need. Actually try to understand that before you respond or put something in their hands. In a way, it's just basic communication skills you are alluding to, as I can hear.
Yeah, and I think people get scared of asking customers what they need. I think there's a real and employees. I think there's a real fear of offending someone or asking the wrong question or using the wrong terminology. But certainly, from a deaf person's perspective, they would much prefer being asked that question than not being asked that question. And then exactly what you just said, assumptions being made about what needs to be done, and the assumptions being entirely incorrect. So it's meeting people where they're at. And I think the pandemic's given us that opportunity to meet people on that more human level, because we've been able, I know, for example, if I call my bank, no doubt their staff member is going to be sitting at their dining room table working. We're in the position now where we are in each other's houses, we're in each other's lives as humans. We feel like we're closer than we ever have been to people's life outside of that business world or that business life. But that's really changed for us. And I think that change will be a long-standing change. So I think people are really open in that situation right now to just be asking customers, how can I communicate with you? What will work for you? And I appreciate that's happening with face coverings now, but there are various things like apps available that you can use, so speech to text apps where you could speak into your phone, and that could then produce that in text. And then the deaf customer would be able to read that text and be able to then respond, either by typing on their notes on their phone, but manage communication like that. So there are solutions out there and things that can be used. It's just a case of testing them out and applying them. But as you said, some customers might want to wear a sunflower lanyard, some may not. Some may be happy using their phone to communicate and type messages via a notes app, some might not. So it's taking the customer where they're at, and being there to support that communication and making that customer feel valued. I mean, that's the key. I almost think that right now there's a really interesting opportunity, because I think that there's lots of people feeling very anxious. We're talking about all customers. I feel anxious when I go into a store right now because I'm in the vulnerable health group. So therefore, when I go out, I feel slightly anxious about what I'm doing, what I'm touching, all of those things. So people who are disabled will feel more anxious. So those businesses that can create a standout experience right now, in my mind, could almost create this super loyalty from customers, whereby when you support someone at their worst and at their hardest, you've almost secured the loyalty or secured the trust for a longer period of time, if that makes sense. So I think it's not only doing the right thing which fits with the brand, but as we said earlier, it has a huge return on investment, in terms of the longer term opportunity in terms of customer loyalty and retention. So yeah, we're in an interesting place right now.
Is there anything that's really surprised you since lockdown started back in March? Just like anything, and what is it and why?
There was one story that came out recently which did surprise me, and it was in an outdoor store. I won't name the store, but it was in an outdoor store, and a deaf girl wasn't wearing a face covering because she's exempt from the rules, and they made a really big deal about the fact that she should be wearing a face covering. She had a hidden disability, i.e. she was deaf, but she also had a cochlear implant, and a cochlear implant is where you have it's not a hearing aid that goes in your ear, but it sort of clips around your ear, and it has also a piece that is a magnetic piece that sits on top of your head as well as a deaf person. So visually, you could see that she was deaf. You could see that, it was obvious. And despite the mother continually telling the retail team that actually that was the case, look, here's her cochlear implant, they basically continued for her to wear a face covering, irrespective of the fact that she's exempt. And that shocked me, because I felt like, as I said earlier, I think we've become more caring and more nurturing of people and understanding of people, because we've had to be, right? Because there's people in situations that have needed more support than what we have maybe. But to see this sort of playing out, I just thought it was really interesting. So I guess that mix of societal response right now, where you've got some businesses that are really understanding and that are going, right, we're going to go out of our way to do this, and some businesses who are sticking, I guess probably trying to stick to rules and making sure that everyone's wearing a face covering, but not understanding the rules about exemptions, bearing in mind that there are quite a lot of people that are actually exempt from wearing face coverings. So they're not understanding of that rule really, and the response to it, because the response didn't have to be like that. It could have been dealt with another way, like asking the customer, oh, are you not wearing a face covering because you're exempt, and allowing the customer to respond and say, yes, I'm exempt because of this, this and this. So I think I found that quite shocking. And I don't think I'd be the only one to find that shocking, to be honest with you.
No, and I guess as well, one thing is the impact on the business, but also the deaf girl here. That's actually, it chaps away on our confidence when we are told we are not fitting in. It just does unconscious, and that's what we have to be very aware about. All the people we can impact in our closer circle and further out circles, what we say and do will be remembered, because we don't forget. We are in a situation we will not forget. And we all try different situations. There's either been, as you said, a really caring experience, if that's been in a shop or that's been in connection with a supplier that they really understand, and you find that midway ground and you stand together on solving this, you will be stronger together on the other side. And the other way around, where you've been treated in an unfair way, or just felt like there was not much understanding and caring and patience there, so we're probably done forever. And I would not turn back to that relationship.
I mean, you don't, do you? That's the truth. I think about, I mean, there was a mobile phone provider that I was with before, and again, I don't do the whole name and shame, but I was with the provider for quite a long time, and I got missold something, and when I tried to resolve the problem of this mis-selling, they basically, said, no, we don't have any records of that. We can't deal with this. We can't, and just the way I was treated was awful. So despite the fact that where I live, that's the best coverage in terms of the network with that particular brand, for me, I just couldn't go back, because it was an experience that stuck with me, and just the way that it was handled was completely wrong. The mis-selling in the first place was wrong, but then the way it was handled after that was wrong. And I do think that if that brand had done a full 360 and said, do you know what, we're so sorry, we shouldn't have questioned that, we should have asked you what exemption you have. If you take ownership of the problems that you cause, and this is true of life in general as well, as we know, if you take ownership of the problems that you solve, you can rectify that. And also, when customers have problems or issues, if you're able to resolve that for them in a timely manner, and even if it's a really big problem, if you can solve that problem for them and solve it in a way that makes the customer really happy, you're building extra loyalty there. You don't think you are, but because you've seen, again, talking about where we're at now, if you see the customer at their worst with their biggest problem they're going to have with you, and you resolve it simply, easily for them, they'll stick with you for longer. So I think it really is just about taking things down to that human level, and understanding people's needs, and working your best to cater to those. And you don't have to get it perfect. It's about trying. So if someone did know a little bit of sign language, and a deaf customer came in and they tried their little bit of sign language, no deaf person's going to find that offensive or embarrassing or any of those things. They'll find it really satisfying that someone actually attempted to use a bit of their language with them, because that doesn't happen. It's very rare. So it's just people putting themselves out there a little bit more, and not being scared of treating someone like another human being.
Yeah, I think it's all about just being human in a way, and meet people where they are. And I think one thing I can see, and I don't know how that this will impact deaf people. I think it will have an impact on everyone. I can feel that, we were very patient and caring. It was almost a theme over the before summer and over the summer, but I can already feel now, as we are approaching autumn and winter, and the financial situation, the reality of that, the government is not popping up society and not flowing out the same amount of money, and money, it becomes a stress factor for many businesses or individuals. You can feel the tension about the second wave. It's here now. We all hope it didn't arrive. We were maybe a bit in hope that the scientists was wrong, but they are never. Very rarely the scientists are wrong about things. The same with climate change. I often say they're not wrong. They looked into it, and they know their stats and numbers. So now we're in this situation where there is again, it feels like everything is thrown up in the air again, but just with an even bigger impact, because now we have the financial center of life thrown out as well, and nobody knows where they are in 6 months in any way. They don't have to have a job. It could be right now I have a job, but I actually really don't know if I have it in 6 months. And the stress of that, and I guess that comes for deaf people as well. On top of that, that they need to they also need people to be a bit patient with them, and we lose our patience when we are under pressure. We're just focusing on us because it's become survival.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those businesses that can really understand that, exactly what I was saying earlier, that when things get really stressful, if you can hold on to that very core of looking after people, um, and it is hard, because as Brits, we don't like going into the winter. It's a thing that all of us moan about all year round, and then when it gets a bit cold, we start moaning about it even more. And it is going to be tougher, because we potentially we won't be able to meet indoors, potentially we'll only be able to meet outdoors, and obviously the weather might preclude that on certain occasions as well. So we are going into what will be way tougher than what we had over the sort of first wave, where the weather was lovely, we could go out for walks, it was, it was pleasant, it was manageable. So it will get harder, but I do think that keeping to your core, like, so our vision is to change the world for deaf people. So as a business, whether things get financially tough or not, that's at the core who we are. That's what we do. So every single thing we do, we live by that mission or that vision to change the world for deaf people. So that's the thing that keeps us surviving and thriving. And I think that as long as businesses can really clue into those bigger missions, and some of the businesses that I've spoken to at large, high levels in the organisation, certainly directorship levels, that's what they're doing now. They're cluing into that really deeper values of the organization and breeding that through teams, so that they can, even if they are in industries that are being affected, and some of the brands that we've been speaking to are being affected by the pandemic right now, but they are literally digging deep and going, right, how do we be who we are and make sure we invest in our team as they are right now, whether that's a reduced number or not, and help them live and breathe those values every day. And that in terms of from a brand perspective is the thing to do. I think it's really challenging for deaf employees right now, because I think that there's lots of uncertainty, and we know from sort of levels of unemployment that it's more likely that a deaf person will be unemployed than a hearing person. So there's all that sort of to play, and then obviously lots of deaf people seeking work at the moment. But again, part of the work that we are focusing on at the moment is working with brands that are recruiting lots of people right now, because the flip side of this is that, yes, there's lots of brands that are having to cut staff numbers, and in the sector we're talking about in terms of focus, that's true, but there are also sectors that are growing. So it's what we're trying to do right now is really understand the sectors that are growing and almost match those to the deaf community, and try and support that low employment rate amongst deaf people, in terms of matching with opportunities right now. So there's always ways of solving these sort of bigger issues. It's just sometimes about being creative about how we do that. And when it comes to deaf employees, they're more likely to stay with the business for longer if they're served well. So as I said, it's difficult for deaf people to find work. Therefore, if they find themselves in a position where their manager understands them, their peer groups are supportive, they feel like they're in a role that they can stay at, they're unlikely to search for another role, because actually finding what they already have, if it's good, is really difficult. So you end out basically keeping deaf staff for much longer than you would hearing staff, which, if we think about retention and the issue that there is there with large businesses, that solves that helps solve that problem as well. So yeah, it's I think there's always going to be challenges, and I think it's about really keying down into the values of the organisation and making sure that your staff still believe that that's true, supporting them, and then moving that further to looking at those businesses that there is opportunity of growth, and yeah, ensuring that they're thinking about deaf customers and deaf employees along the growth journey that they're having as well, and not excluding anyone.
I think it's very interesting you say there. I call also the diverse, approach to recruitment, because in my previous part of my career, I worked in McDonald's, and it was part of a people team where our strategy was actually to recruit people with disabilities, because we saw that all respect, the hunger was bigger, and they stayed for longer. They appreciated they got a chance in a way. Of course, it took a bit more work to get them into the job, the induction, but you should do a proper induction no matter who you're on board. So you had to maybe spend 15% extra. But we are talking about here, there was a guy in a restaurant. He had a disability. I can't remember exactly what it was, but normally an average in that restaurant there would probably be the 2 to 3 years, was quite good. But he was when I left, he's been there for 11 years. 11 years in that McDonald's restaurant. He came every week on 2 shifts for 5 hours. That consistency, and just knowing that person comes and do those fries every Monday or Friday, whatever it is, it was invaluable, as they said, the leadership team in that restaurant, and also the energy they brought in, because they just are so happy to have this opportunity, and maybe they don't have a full-time job, but they have an opportunity to add value. So that hunger, I think sometimes you have to remember as well. We often become very focusing on recruiting people that look like us, or we have a picture of how they should look. So yeah.
And I think you've just hit the nail on the head, because like you said, maybe you've got that extra 15% time that's needed to facilitate that happening through the induction process. But if you then look at that comparative from your 2 to 3 years, moving that to 11 years, I mean, that's, you think about the saving in terms of the cost saving, having to re-recruit, the time saving, having someone not in the business and having to bring someone back into the business, and then the time to retrain that team member. Or if you think, like, take that 2 to 3 years, over that 11 years, you're re-recruiting into that role numbers of times within that 11 years. So it's the opportunity to businesses to recruit from, like you said, from diverse groups of people is huge. And I just don't think people recognise that. And I think it is the fear of the unknown and a little bit of the, well, I wouldn't know what, I've had conversations with employers before where we've talked about this and they've said, well, I wouldn't know what to do with a deaf employee. Like, I wouldn't know how to number one, how to recruit them. I wouldn't know how to induct them, how to train them, how to support them in their role, all of that stuff. And there's that fear factor. But there are schemes such as Access to Work, which is a government funded scheme that funds support in the workplace for disabled employees. So there are schemes out there that will support. If a deaf person, for example, works in an office environment and needs to go to a team meeting, the Access to Work scheme will pay for an interpreter so that they can access that environment, or pay for a note taker, or so pay for basically the adjustment that would need to be taken to make that work. And the same would happen in retail or hospitality. If it was, any of the huddle meetings, there's ways to do that via remote interpreting. There's so many ways to do that. So sometimes it's just removing the fear and the unknown. And people do get fearful of the unknown, and they want to do it right. They don't want to exclude anyone, unintentionally.
Is there any places, because I'm sure you could talk for hours about all the different tools accessible for businesses to both recruit and actually make the environments better for people working in there as customers? Where should people go and have a look for information and inspiration to either revamp this journey or get this journey started?
Yeah, well, I mean, our blog, and it's not about self-promoting, it's just actually simply that we write a lot of really helpful information. We have a blog on our website that people can go to get relevant articles and stuff like that. And we also have various sorts of downloads that we produce that, help people think about employing deaf people and stuff. So we offer the opportunity for people to jump on a call and we give them tons of advice. And we've done, certainly during the pandemic, we've done that way more than we would normally. Not saying we wouldn't normally do that, but we've really put ourselves out there to be those people that people can come to and ask those questions that they just don't know the answers to. So yeah, I mean, it's just sort of seeking the expertise where it is and looking into it. But it's, as I said, it's definitely a massive opportunity.
Is there any tech that can help companies? Is any tech they should look into, like a minimum tech? You mentioned earlier it's just a note. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be tech. What is your thinking on tech and helping deaf people being customers and employees?
Well, I think tech has its place, but I think it's remembering that tech has its place alongside all of the traditional methods of how we communicate as humans. Because I think for me that's way more important than any of the tech that you could put in, because you can eradicate most problems that way. I mean, what we've seen, just I'll go sort of through a range of things that we've seen happening in retail and hospitality. There are, for example, with face coverings, there are companies that have produced transparent face masks. So they're face coverings and they have a transparent plastic panel that sits in front of the mouth that enables a deaf person to lip read. So that would be for someone working either in hospitality or in retail, for them to be wearing that. And it also, because of the fact that you can lip read, you can also see someone smiling. And that makes a massive impact into how we feel as customers, especially in this really weird world that we're in now. We can't see anyone smiling. It feels really strange. So transparent face masks are a really simple way of engaging with your customers, whether they be deaf or hearing, by the way, because that being able to see someone smile, that again reassures you, makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel like you're welcome, but you're also safe. There's so much that does to us for humans. It's unreal. And then there are things like, as I said earlier, you've got the sunflower lanyards for customers to identify themselves. There's also various badges that some deaf people are wearing, saying, I can't lip read through your mask, please understand. sunflower lanyard scheme, the speech to text apps. There's also the traditional loop systems as well that often get forgotten about. So loop systems are obviously there to amplify the particular area for the deaf person. So the deaf person would switch their hearing aid to a different setting, and then they would be able to access the sound around that particular setting. So it's crucial with loop systems that you actually check regularly that they're working. Feedback from the deaf community is that they don't get checked basically, and that they're not working. So that's a problem. So if you have systems like loop systems, please make sure you check them regularly so that they're actually, you know, that they're working. So that can be really helpful. And if we're talking about deaf people that are sign language users, there are various, obviously you could have an interpreter face to face, but there are also various ways of having an interpreter sort of on call almost. So there are VRS providers that if you needed an interpreter right here, right now, you would call them up and you'd have an interpreter online. So there are various ways. If you're, for example, in a hospitality setting and have a deaf employee that's a sign language user, if you want to access communication quickly, then that's a good way to sort of eradicate or improve that communication. And again, the scheme I talked about earlier with access to work, that would cover any adjustments like that. So that would be paid for as part of that scheme. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things. What's been really interesting as well is, as we know, for businesses that do operate um, in a face-to-face environment and in an office environment, you've got all the tech like Microsoft Teams and Zoom and all of those sorts of tech platforms that we've been using to conduct regular meetings with team members. And very recently, Zoom have actually popped a change to their software so that deaf people can use interpreters on their software easily, so by them having more power to basically pin who they want to see on the screen, so that they can pin, for example, the presenter and the interpreter, so that the interpreter doesn't become a really small person who they can't see in the mix of all the other people in the meeting. So it's been really satisfying, certainly from our perspective, to see brands understanding the challenges that were there before, obviously, but now we're working in these different environments. It's nice to see things adapting quickly. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think people are considering needs more willingly right now. And when you see large brands like Zoom making these changes, it's inspirational for other brands to look at and go, oh, they're doing that. What can we do to think about these customer groups?
Yeah, and it's so interesting, because they are probably, one of the most have become. They were probably very impactful before this, but become very an impactful organization because this is the way we communicate a lot of the day. You almost need to put a now a level. I'm starting to pick up the phone now because the Zoom thing is just so dreading in a way sometimes that it takes so much energy of you. It's a very different way, and I think it's very clever they have seen and very human. They've seen there's a massive need there, so they're definitely fulfilling more than 250 million people's need maybe out there, or definitely a very big part of them. So tech can help, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the tech can help, but I think the businesses go to that first. Like businesses we speak to, the first question is, what tech can I put in place to solve the problem? And my response to that is, yes, there is tech. There's things that you can do, definitely. Like on a website, for example, you can have online chat, which is an obvious thing. But for a deaf customer, it means that there's a facility they can use rather than having to rely on a phone call. So that, there are things like that yeah, absolutely enhance the customer experience. There's no question about that. But really we're talking about understanding a customer where they're at, and looking at communicating with them in a way that works for them. So not assuming that we can solve problems by tech always. I think we're in a world right now where tech plays such a big part, and I think businesses are looking for those quick win, those easy solutions. But I almost feel like if they can nail their customer experience, then think back like 20-30 years when we didn't have access to the tech we have now. Customer experience was good. We didn't have, there would be places that you wouldn't get that customer experience, but the sole focus would be on that. And if we think about the decline in the high street right now, what we really are looking at is retailers that are wowing customers. They're the retailers that will survive this, because they're the places that customers will want to go and experience that thing that they're experiencing. And that's an intangible thing. It's not it's a feeling that we have. It's a way that someone makes us feel, a way that someone treats us. So we can't replace that by tech. And I think that pop the tech in where it's useful, but just absolutely don't forget that the high street is dependent on people having an experience, and that's why we are going out. We're going out to have an experience. So that's the absolute key.
It's always interesting because tech often becomes, they always think that's the key solution, digitalization or tech, but often it's actually more the principles about how you operate business, and tech will just help you do some of the heavy lifting and make it easier for you to reach more people. So you're spot on. Um, every time we talk, Victoria, I definitely get the feel that there's a very authentic person here on a mission. How do you get all this energy to keep going? Because you're the CEO and founder of this organization, and you're just on it because even though it's a difficult time, you can hear now as we talk, you just have energy levels that is amazing. How do you find that energy? Because you must go somewhere and recharge at some point.
What do I do? Do you know what? I've always had this level of energy, and I don't think that will ever change about me. And it's funny because that's what all my friends say. They're like, "How? Where does it come from? What do you do?" I'm very self-aware. I know what my needs are. I'm very self-aware, so I know when I need some quiet time. I'm very aware of what that looks like. If I need time with friends, I know I do the things that I need to do. I listen to my body. I eat well. I drink well. Um, yeah, I do all the things. I do all the things that I need to do to keep myself sane. I mean, during the pandemic, I've got two young children. I've got a 7 and a 9-year-old. So during the pandemic, I had two children to homeschool in different years, as well as a business to run and a team to motivate and keep going. And they had kids at home too. So it was tough. But I think if you're content in yourself and you're looking for the joy in life, of which there is plenty of joy, like I said earlier, the period that we're in lockdown, the weather was absolutely stunning. And that sounds like a small joy, but because there were less cars on the road, I could hear more birds singing in my garden. And that sounds really basic, but I guess for me it's those really basic things that have a big impact, like having a nice cup of coffee, or having a good chat with a friend, or having a nice walk when it's sunny but it's cold out. It really, I'm a pretty simple human being in that sense, that I like the small things. But also, I know that what we're doing as a business, and the impact that we're making, and and the ability of the larger impact we can make. So that keeps me constantly motivated. I guess if you'd have said to me 14 years ago, because I was as excited, obviously, back 14 years ago. If you'd have said to me, you're going to be as excited in 14 years as you are now, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But it still feels, it's just who I am. And it feels so authentic to me to be doing this. And I think sometimes you're put on this earth to do something, and this is my thing. And I'm in the right lane, doing the right thing. I don't compromise. I'll help anyone that needs help. It's not all about running a profitable business for me. It's about that bigger mission, and about just reaching out and helping people. That's what we do. We do that all day, and I live in a happy place because I know that I'm making impact. So that's me, really.
Yeah, it is definitely no doubt that I will just boil it down to you live and breathe your purpose every day and in and out, and that's where you get your energy from. I've seen that with other people as well. So I think try to find that purpose in all this. That could be a good advice. Try to really find and live your purpose if you don't do that already, because you will not only feel really well, but you will have an insane energy to move things forward. Leading on to the last question, Victoria, what is your top three advice, or there could be two or one advice for leaders out there to, let's say, make the world a better place for? It could be with the angle of deaf people. What would you leave them with on this podcast?
Okay, so number one, as you probably gathered already, a word that I've probably used more than any other word apart from the word deaf is communication. It's so overlooked. And when I talk about communication, I'm talking about communicating internally and externally. So when we communicate, we're talking about externally communicating to our customers, whether that be in that interaction or how we communicate via our website, via the media, all of that sort of stuff. Thinking about that truly, and doing that well, but also really understanding that we have internal customers, and that's our teams, right? So if we institute things like the sunflower lanyard scheme, do tell your team so that they know, so that when a customer comes in and they ask for it, they're not ruffling around trying to find this thing that they've not been told about. So make sure that the initiatives that are put in place, like a loop system, like a lanyard system, if there's any signage, any of that stuff, make sure that your team are aware of what you're putting in place, because that makes, if the customer comes in and they know, and the team member knows what they're doing, that the customer is like, wow, you've put something in place for me, and you know how to use it, and you're doing it. So I think that's absolutely key. Other things that I would suggest, be aware of the exemptions with the face coverings, and that's a really sort of a right now thing, but be aware of them. I'd hate to see any other examples like the situation that happened in this outdoor sort of sports store. That would just be devastating. So absolutely make sure that you're doing that. Another probably opportunity that's overlooked massively is businesses will have disabled employees. So any business will have disabled employees. They might not know they have, but they definitely have. Tune into those employees' experiences and take insight from them, and look at how you can use that insight to impact your customer experience. It's a wealth of knowledge that you have within your business. They understand your business, they understand the brand, they understand how that can be applied to themselves as a customer, and sort of put themselves in those shoes. So absolutely engage with your teams and make sure you're using any insight or intelligence internally to improve the sort of external aspects as well.
Some amazing advice, and especially I like the last one, because we just talked about how many people it was that's actually having a hearing disability. You could actually already have them without knowing them. Your experts on the ground that would straight away be able to improve this, both from an employee and customer experience point of view. So you can take it 80% of the way without actually have to go out and look for anything. Just ask normally. And normally if the CEO asks, there will always be somebody saying, okay, now I can actually make a difference. They are ready to listen to me. So, and often is my experience, people will turn up and give you some great advice, as did the CEO and the leader of a business, because the challenge is often you don't ask and listen. so I think that was a really good point. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think just to add to that, you're also creating more loyalty, aren't you? Because what you're actually doing is you're telling your team member that they're valued, and that their opinion's valued, and that you understand them, and you're seeing them for who they are, and you're taking their experience into consideration. So again, you're just creating what is this super loyalty with employees, where they feel like you care, you listen, you really value what they have to say, and you're willing to listen to what they have to say and implement it within the business. I have a deaf friend that works in a company, and she is constantly asked by the management team, what do we do if that happens? What do we do if that happens? And she just said, I feel like they actually care about deaf customers, because they're asking me about my experience, and they're applying what I'm telling them to what they're doing. And I just think that that's such a huge message to be sharing within the business, that you're looking for the expertise within your team, and you're listening and you're implementing based on that. We have to take these suggestions, into an operational consideration, don't we? Is that feasible? Is that going to work? But just gathering that insight is using experience and intelligence you have within the business, and also showing that you're looking after your staff and you care about their opinions.
That was a super conversation, Victoria. Thank you so much for your time, and also giving us this amazing overview about the, as you said in the beginning, the opportunity of this market, but also the challenges there is within deaf people right now, engaging both with an employee experience, but also the customer experience of being, especially around now, face masks have become mandatory. So I will wish you all the energy and power you need to drive your organization forward, and keep on doing all the good work. There's really need for it out there. And I hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Victoria, thank you so much for your insight into how to make the customer experience better for deaf people. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please give us a like, share, rate, or subscribe to one of our channels. Tune in next time for another interview, and in the meantime, find out more about us and subscribe to our newsletter at hospitalitymavericks.com. Thanks for listening, and be Maverick.